The refugee transport Bright Morning had been running for 6 days straight when the third engine finally gave out. And Captain Myri Jing knew in that moment that her ship and everyone aboard were about to die. They had fled the border. Conflict between the Zerentine Empire and the Helix. Confederation with 400 souls packed into a vessel designed for 200. And they had pushed the engines far beyond their safety limits, trying to reach neutral space before Imperial patrols caught up with them. Now those engines were failing one after another, and the nearest inhabited world was 30 light years away. All hands braced for emergency landing. Captain Zheng announced over the ship-wide communication system, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. I repeat, all hands brace for impact. In Cargo Bay 7, which had been converted into emergency housing for families, a woman named Sujin Park pulled her daughter close and wrapped herself around the girl as the ship began to shake apart around them. Close your eyes, Yuna, Sujin whispered into her daughter's hair. Close your eyes and think about grandmother's garden. Remember the flowers we planted last spring? 12-year-old Yuna squeezed her eyes shut and tried to remember the feeling of soil between her fingers and the smell of roses in the warm Korean sun. But the screaming of metal and the cries of terrified passengers kept pulling her back to the present nightmare. The ship hit the atmosphere of the quarantine planet at an angle that tore away the forward sections instantly, and the cargo bays tumbled through burning air like leaves caught in a hurricane before slamming into the rocky surface of an alien world. Yuna woke to silence and pain. Her left arm hung at a wrong angle, and something warm and wet ran down the side of her face. And when she opened her eyes, she saw only darkness and twisted metal. Iyama. She called out, her voice cracking. Iyama, where are you? She reached out with her good hand and found her mother's body lying still beside her. And even in the darkness, she could tell from the angle of her mother's head that Sujin Park would never answer her again. Yuna did not scream or cry, because something inside her had gone numb in a way that she did not understand. And she simply lay there for a long time, holding her mother's cold hand and listening to the wind howling through the wreckage. When she finally pulled herself free of the debris and crawled out into the alien daylight, she found a landscape of volcanic rock and poisonous yellow sky stretching in every direction. The ship had scattered itself across several kilometers of barren plateau, and fires burned in a dozen places where fuel cells had ruptured on impact. She walked through the wreckage for hours, calling out for survivors. But every body she found was already cold, and still, she was alone. The first night nearly killed her when temperatures dropped and wind cut through her thin clothing like frozen knives. But she found shelter in a section of hull plating that had bent into a crude tent shape, and she huddled there, shaking, until dawn. The second day, she found emergency rations in a supply crate and water purification tablets that would let her drink from the toxic streams, and she realized that survival was possible if she was careful. But on the third day, the predators found her. They were six-legged creatures with too many eyes and jaws that split open in 4 directions. And they hunted in packs that communicated through sounds too low for human ears to hear. Yuna ran. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to collapse beneath her. And she ran even when she heard the creatures gaining ground behind her. And she ran because her mother had always told her that giving up was the one thing that could never be forgiven. She found the cave entrance by accident, stumbling through a gap in the rocks that the predators were too large to follow. And she crawled deeper into the darkness until the sounds of frustrated snarling faded behind her. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber lit by bioluminescent fungi growing along the walls, and Yuna collapsed on the stone floor, gasping for breath and trembling from exhaustion and terror. She lay there for a long time, watching the soft blue light pulse gently like a heartbeat. And she was just beginning to think that she might survive another day when she heard breathing that was not her own It came from deeper in the cave. A slow rhythmic sound like wind moving through a canyon. And as Yuna's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw a shape that her mind struggled to process. The creature was enormous, easily 30 meters long from the tip of its snout to the end of its tail, with scales that might once have been purple but had faded to gray, and wings folded against its serpentine body like sheets of leather stretched over ancient bone. It was a dragon. The word came to her from her grandmother's stories, from the Korean legends of great serpents who brought rain and protected the innocent. And even though she knew intellectually that those stories were just myths, she could not think of any other name for what lay before her. The dragon's eyes opened, revealing irises of molten gold that fixed upon her with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. "What are you?" the creature spoke, its voice rumbling through the chamber like distant thunder. And Yuna realized with shock that she could understand it through the translation implant all refugees were given. She should have been terrified, and some part of her was, but a larger part was simply too exhausted and too broken to feel anything as strong as fear. "I am Yuna," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "My ship crashed and everyone else is dead, and I have been walking for 3 days and I'm very tired." The dragon stared at her for a long moment, and something flickered in those golden eyes that might have been surprise or curiosity or something else entirely. "Are you going to eat me?" Yuna asked, because it seemed like the sort of question she should ask. "No," the dragon replied after a pause. "I'm not." "Oh," Yuna said, nodding once. "That is good." Then her body finally gave out, and she collapsed on the stone floor as fever and exhaustion claimed her consciousness. Valkyrex watched the tiny creature fall, and he felt something stir in his chest that he had thought died long ago. She was human, he realized. A member of that young primitive species that the Empire barely acknowledged as sentient. And yet she had looked at him without the terror that every other being had shown him for 3,000 years. She had simply asked if he was going to eat her. And when he said no, she had accepted his word without question. He should leave her to die. He knew, because getting involved with other creatures only brought pain. And his heart had already been broken too many times to risk again. But as he watched her shiver on the cold stone, her small body curled into itself for warmth, he found that he could not turn away. He moved closer, careful not to crush her with his massive form. And he curved his body around her like a wall against the cold. Her fever burned hot against his scales, and her breathing was shallow and weak. But she was alive. For now, that was enough. He would decide what to do with her in the morning. The fever lasted for 9 days, and during that time Valkyrex found himself doing things he had never imagined possible for one of his kind. He hunted small creatures and brought them back to the cave, where he cooked them with careful bursts of flame until the meat was soft enough for the human child to chew. And he carried water from the underground streams in the cupped hollow of his massive claws. And he stayed awake through the nights listening to her breathing to make sure it did not stop. On the 3rd day of her fever, Yuna began talking in her sleep, calling out for her mother in a language that the translation implant rendered as desperate pleas for comfort. And Valkyrex found himself lowering his head close to hers and humming a deep rumbling tone that his own mother had once used to soothe him when he was young. He did not know if it helped, but she grew quieter when he did it, and that was enough. On the 9th day, her fever broke, and she opened her eyes to find a dragon watching her with an expression that she somehow recognized as concern. "You are still here," Yuna said, her voice rough from days of disuse. "I am," Valkyrex replied. "Where else would I be?" She considered this for a moment, then slowly pushed herself into a sitting position, wincing at the ache in her muscles and the lingering pain in her arm, which she had somehow set and splinted while she was unconscious. "Thank you for not letting me die," she said simply. Velcorix did not know how to respond to gratitude, so he simply dipped his head in acknowledgement and pushed a portion of cooked meat toward her with one claw. They sat in silence while she ate, and he found himself studying her with a curiosity he had not felt in centuries. She was so small, barely larger than one of his eyes, with soft brown skin and black hair that fell around her face in tangled knots. And yet, there was something in the way she held herself that spoke of strength far greater than her fragile form suggested. "I am Velcorix," he said when she finished eating. "I was once a protector of the Zeranthian Empire, but now I am nothing." Una looked up at him with dark eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about dragons," she said. "She said they were noble creatures who protected people and brought the rain. And I always thought they were just stories, but now I think maybe she was remembering something real." Velcorix felt something shift in his chest at her words. "Your grandmother sounds wise," he said quietly. "She died 2 years ago." Una replied, "But I still remember everything she taught me. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. And slowly something extraordinary began to happen in that cave beneath the volcanic mountains." Velcorix found himself teaching the human child how to survive on this hostile world, showing her which fungi were safe to eat and which streams were too toxic to approach, teaching her to read the patterns in the sky that warned of coming acid storms, and Una taught him things in return. Though he did not realize it at first, she talked constantly, filling the silence that had surrounded him for 3 years with stories about her home planet called Earth and her family and the Korean culture that her grandmother had worked so hard to preserve even as they fled from world to world. She told him about dragons in human mythology, how they were seen as wise and powerful beings who tested heroes and rewarded those who showed courage and honor. And Velcorix found himself wondering if perhaps his kind and hers had crossed paths long ago in some forgotten age. "Why did they exile you?" Una asked one evening as they sat at the cave entrance, watching the sunset paint the toxic clouds in shades of orange and red. Velcorix was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because I refused to kneel before a murderer," he said. "Because I spoke truth when silence would have been safer. And because the Empire feared what I represented more than they feared what I could do." Una nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "My father used to say that speaking truth is the hardest thing a person can do," she said. "Because lies are easy, but truth costs everything. Your father sounds wise as well." "He was," Una said softly. "He died in the crash with my mother." She did not cry, but Velcorix saw the grief that lived behind her eyes, and he understood that she had built walls around her heart, just as he had built walls around his own. "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it more than he had meant anything in a very long time. "It is okay," Una replied, though they both knew it was not. "I have you now." Velcorix did not know what to say to that, so he simply moved closer and let her lean against his side as the stars emerged, one by one in the darkening sky, 6 months after the crash. The predator pack that had chased Una into the cave finally found them. Velcorix had grown comfortable in his isolation, had allowed himself to believe that this world had nothing left that could threaten him, and so he did not smell the creatures approaching until they were already at the cave entrance. Una was deeper in the tunnels gathering fungi for their evening meal when the alpha predator launched itself at Velcorix with jaws spread wide. He had not fought in 3 years, and his muscles had weakened from inactivity and despair. But the moment he heard Una scream his name, something exploded inside him that burned away all the weakness and weariness in an instant. He roared with a voice that shook the mountain itself, and flame erupted from his throat for the first time since his exile. And he threw himself at the pack with all the fury of a Kovathi warrior, defending the last thing in the universe that mattered to him. The battle was brutal and desperate, and by the time the last predator fled into the darkness, Valcoryx was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and his left wing hung at an angle that suggested it might never fully heal, but Una was safe. She ran to him as he collapsed on the cave floor, and she pressed her small hands against his wounds as if she could hold his blood inside him through sheer force of will. "Do not die," she commanded, her voice fierce despite the tears streaming down her face. "I forbid you to die. Do you understand me?" Valcoryx looked up at this tiny human child who was ordering around a 3,000-year-old dragon. And despite the pain that racked his body, he felt something that he had almost forgotten existed. He felt joy. "I understand," he rumbled. "I will try my best to obey." She spent the next 3 weeks nursing him back to health, using salvaged medical supplies from the crashed ship to treat his wounds, sleeping curled against his side so she could monitor his breathing through the night. And when he was finally strong enough to stand again, she looked up at him with an expression that brooked no argument. "You are my family now," she declared. "I do not care that you are a dragon and I am a human. I do not care that we are stuck on this horrible planet. You are mine and I am yours, and that is how it is going to be." Valcoryx considered telling her that Kovathi did not form family bonds with other species, that such things were simply not done, that he was ancient and she was a child, and the whole situation was absurd. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was simply, "Yes. I think that is how it is going to be." And for the first time in 3,000 years, the last Kovathi smiled. 2 years had passed since the crash, and Una Park had transformed from a frightened child into something far more formidable. She was 14 now, lean and strong from daily survival on a world that killed the weak without mercy. And she moved through the volcanic landscape with a confidence that would have shocked anyone who had known her before. Valcoryx watched her scale a cliff face to reach a nest of protein-rich eggs, and he marveled at how much she had grown in such a short time. Humans were remarkable creatures. He had come to understand, not because of their strength or their technology, but because of their stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even when all logic said they should. They had built a life together in this hostile place, a routine of hunting and gathering and storytelling that had become comfortable in its familiarity. And Valcoryx had almost forgotten that they were not the only beings in the universe. That illusion shattered on a morning when the sky split open with the thunder of atmospheric entry ships, Una said, shading her eyes as she watched 3 vessels descend through the yellow clouds. Imperial design based on the hull configuration. Valcoryx felt his heart begin to race, and old instincts he had thought long dead surged through his body. "We need to hide," he said, already moving toward the cave entrance. But Una did not follow. "They might be here to rescue survivors," she said, her voice carrying a hope that Valcoryx wished he could share. "They might not know the planet is inhabited." "They know," Valcoryx replied grimly. "This world is quarantined specifically because I am here. Any Imperial vessel that lands is either hunting me or investigating something they consider a threat." Una looked at him with those dark eyes that had grown so much harder over the past 2 years. "Then we face them together," she said, "because I am not leaving you and you are not leaving me." Commander Seojin Heil of the Imperial Survey Corps had expected this mission to be simple. Investigate the distress beacon detected from the crashed refugee vessel, document any survivors for processing, and return to base with a full report. He had not expected to find evidence of a massive creature living in the mountains near the crash site, and he certainly had not expected his xenobiology specialist to turn pale when she analyzed the scale samples they collected. "Commander," Agent Mirith Kalos said, her voice unusually tight, "these scales belong to a Kovathi." Heil stared at her without comprehension. "That is impossible," he said. "The Korvathi are extinct." "Not extinct," Kalos replied. "Eliminated. There is a difference." And apparently, one survived. She pulled up a file on her datapad and showed him an image of a massive dragon-like creature standing before the Imperial Senate. "Velkorix," she said, "the last of his kind. Exiled to this planet 5 years ago for sedition against Emperor Varth." Hyle felt a cold smile spread across his face. "Then we have found something far more valuable than refugee survivors," he said. "Imagine the reward for bringing the Emperor the head of his most famous enemy." Something flickered in Agent Kalos's eyes that Hyle did not notice. Something that might have been discussed, or perhaps something deeper. "Sir, the Korvathi were protectors of the Empire for 10,000 years, she said carefully. "Some might argue that executing the last one would be a mistake. Some might argue many things," Hyle replied. "But I argue that promotion and wealth await whoever completes this mission successfully. Mobilize the squad." They found the cave 3 hours later, and Hyle ordered his soldiers to surround all exits while he and Kalos approached the main entrance. What they found inside made even the hardened commander pause. A massive dragon lay coiled in the central chamber, its scales dull with age, but its eyes burning with ancient fire. And standing before it with arms spread wide was a human girl no older than 14. "You will not touch him," the girl declared, her voice ringing through the cave with absolute conviction. Hyle recovered his composure and laughed. "Step aside, child," he said. "This creature is an enemy of the Empire and has been sentenced to death. You have no authority here." "I have every authority," the girl shot back. "Because he is my family, and I will not let you take him." Valkyrix rumbled something in a language the translation systems could not parse, and the girl responded in the same tongue before turning back to face the soldiers. "My name is Una Park," she said. "I am a survivor of the refugee transport Bright Morning, and this Korvathi has protected me and raised me for 2 years. He is not your enemy. He is the last guardian of an order that your empire destroyed out of fear and jealousy." Agent Kalos stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "The girl speaks truth, Commander," she said. "The Korvathi were not traitors. They were eliminated because the previous emperors feared their power and influence." Hyle's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You would side with seditionists, Agent Kalos." "I would side with history," Kalos replied, "and with honor. The Korvathi protected this empire for longer than any dynasty has ruled it, and we repaid them with extinction." She turned to face the soldiers, who stood with weapons raised. "I served in the academy with many of you," she said. "I know you joined the Corps because you believed in justice and protection, not murder. Look at what stands before you, a creature who could tear us apart in seconds. And yet he shelters behind a human child rather than attack. Does that seem like a monster to you?" Silence stretched through the cave as the soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Commander Hyle's face twisted with rage. "This is treason," he snarled, raising his weapon toward Kalos. "I will deal with you myself before." He never finished the sentence. Valkyrix moved faster than any creature that Sai should have been able to move, his tail sweeping out in a blur that knocked the weapon from Hyle's hand and sent the commander crashing against the cave wall. "You will not harm her," the dragon said, his voice shaking the stone around them. "You will not harm anyone under my protection ever again." Hyle scrambled for his sidearm, and in that moment, everything happened at once. Kalos drew her own weapon and fired, her shot taking Hyle in the shoulder before he could aim. And 2 of the soldiers raised their weapons toward her while 3 others hesitated, and the remaining 4 actually stepped back with their hands raised in surrender. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, Commander Hyle lay dead from a wound that might have come from Kalos or might have come from his own loyalists, who had decided they did not want to die for his ambition. and the surviving soldiers stood in a loose circle looking at each other with expressions of shock and dawning realization. What do we do now? One of them asked. Kalos holstered her weapon and looked at Yuna, who had not moved from her position shielding Valkyrex throughout the entire confrontation. We tell command that we found no survivors and no sign of the Kavati, Kalos said. We tell them the planet remains uninhabited and should stay quarantined. And we never speak of this again. Why would you do this? Valkyrex asked. Genuine confusion in his ancient voice. Kalos met his gaze without flinching. Because my grandmother told me stories about the Kavathi, she said. About how they were the conscience of the Empire before the Empire decided it no longer wanted a conscience. And because I have spent my entire career waiting for a chance to do something that actually mattered. She looked at Yuna, and something like admiration crossed her features. Your family did something today that all our weapons could not, she said. She reminded soldiers what honor looks like. That is not a gift I will waste. The soldiers left that evening with a promise of silence. But as they departed, Kalos paused at the cave entrance and looked back. This cannot last forever, she said. Eventually someone else will come, and they may not be as willing to listen. Then we will be ready, Yuna replied, her hand resting on Valkyrix's scaled hide. Kalos nodded once and disappeared into the darkness, leaving a dragon and a girl alone once more beneath an alien sky. 5 years had passed since the Imperial soldiers left the quarantine planet with their promise of silence. And the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Zeranthian Empire was fracturing from within as corruption and endless wars drained resources and loyalty from 1,000 subject worlds. And in the chaos of that decline, a new power was rising. Humanity had grown. Yuna learned about it from Agent Merith Kalos, who had kept her promise and returned twice each year with supplies and news, and eventually with an offer that would change everything. The human colonies have formed an alliance, Kalos explained during her most recent visit. They have been building ships and training soldiers and making deals with every species that feels oppressed by imperial rule. And they are looking for symbols. She looked at Yuna, now 19 years old, and forged by 7 years of survival into something that moved like a warrior and spoke like a diplomat. Stories about you have spread, Kalos continued. The human girl and her dragon, the child who tamed a Korvathi, the survivor who stood down Imperial soldiers with nothing but her voice. People tell these stories in whispered conversations 100 worlds. Valkyrex stirred from his resting position. His scales now shot through with veins of silver. That had not been there before. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. Kalos took a deep breath. Ambassador, Dahyun Kwan of the Human Alliance wants to meet you, she said. Both of you. He believes your story could unite the coalition that is forming against the Empire. He believes you could be the proof that different species can stand together against tyranny. Yuna looked at Valkyrix, and years of shared experience passed between them in a single glance. We would have to leave, she said quietly. After everything we have built here, we would, Valkyrix agreed. But perhaps it is time. He lifted his massive head and looked toward the cave entrance where gray daylight filtered through volcanic haze. I was exiled here to be forgotten, he said. To die alone as the last memory of my kind faded into nothing. But you found me, and you refused to let me disappear. Perhaps now it is our turn to make sure that others are not forgotten either. The journey off-world required Kalos to call in favors she had been saving for years. But eventually, she arranged transport on a smuggler vessel whose captain owed her enough that he did not ask questions about his unusual passengers. When they finally arrived at the Coalition assembly point on a space station orbiting a neutral world, Yuna stepped off the ship into a corridor filled with beings from dozens of species. who all stopped and stared in stunned silence at the massive dragon that emerged behind her. Ambassador Do Yung Quan was waiting for them. A tall man with gray hair and kind eyes who bowed deeply to both of them before speaking. "The honor is mine," he said in Korean, which Yuna had taught Valkorix during their years together. "I have waited a long time to meet the girl who spoke truth to Imperial soldiers and the guardian who protected her. The honor is shared." Yuna replied in the formal style her grandmother had taught her. "We are here because we believe in what you are building." The assembly hall was vast, filled with representatives from species that had suffered under Imperial rule for generations. And when Yuna and Valkorix entered together, a wave of whispered conversation swept through the crowd like wind through tall grass. They walked to the central platform where a podium awaited. And Yuna looked out at the sea of alien faces and felt for just a moment like the frightened child who had crawled into a dragon's cave so many years ago. Then she felt Valkorix's presence behind her, solid and warm and unwavering, and she remembered that she was no longer that child. "I was 12 years old when my ship crashed on a quarantine planet," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber through the translation systems embedded in the walls. "My parents died in that crash, and I should have died too. But I survived because a creature that the Empire called a monster showed me more kindness than any Imperial citizen ever had." She gestured to Valkorix, who lowered his head in acknowledgement. "The Zyrantian Empire told us that the Korvathi were dangerous, that they were threats to be eliminated, that their extinction was necessary for galactic security. But the truth is that the Empire feared them because they represented something that tyranny cannot tolerate." She paused and let her words sink in. "They represented conscience," she said. "They represented the courage to speak truth, even when silence would be safer. And they represented the principle that protecting the weak is more important than serving the powerful." Valkorix stepped forward then, and his voice rumbled through the chamber with the weight of 3,000 years. "I have lived longer than most civilizations," he said. "I have watched empires rise and fall and rise again. And I have learned that power built on fear always destroys itself in the end." He looked down at Yuna with eyes that held depths of emotion that no translator could fully convey. "But I have also learned something new in these past 7 years," he continued. "Something that a human child taught me when I had forgotten how to hope. That the smallest hearts often carry the greatest fire. And that love, given freely across the boundaries of species and history and difference, is the only force that can truly change the universe." He turned to address the assembly directly. "The Empire exiled me to die forgotten. But instead I found family. They tried to break humanity by scattering refugees across the stars. But instead humans grew stronger. They believed that fear and division would keep their subjects weak forever. But here we stand together as proof that they were wrong." Yuna took his claw in her hand, and together they faced the coalition as a single united front. "We are asking you to do something that has never been done," Yuna said. "To set aside the suspicions and fears that have kept your species separated for generations and to stand together against those who would keep you divided. It will not be easy, and it will not be safe, and many of us may not survive what comes next." She smiled then. "And those who saw it would remember that smile for the rest of their lives. But we will face it together," she said. "As family." The vote was not close. The coalition formed that day would grow to include over 200 worlds within the next year. And humanity would find itself at the heart of an alliance that had seemed impossible just a decade before. And at the center of it all stood a young woman from Earth and an ancient dragon from a dead world. Bound together by something stronger than blood or politics or history, Ambassador Quan found them later on the observation deck, watching stars wheel past in the eternal dance of the cosmos. "What will you do now?" he asked. Yuna looked at Valkorix. And the dragon looked back at her, and between them passed an understanding that needed no words. "We will do what we have always done," Una said. "We will protect those who need protecting. And we will speak truth when silence would be easier. And we will remind the galaxy that family is not about what species you are, or where you came from." She leaned against Valcorix's side, feeling the warmth of his scales and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "It is about choosing each other," she finished. Every single day, Valcorix rumbled in agreement. And if the sound contained something that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob of joy, neither of them mentioned it. The universe stretched out before them, vast and dangerous and full of possibilities. They faced it together. That was all that mattered. The great hall of the Zerenthian Senate stretched for nearly a kilometer in every direction, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness far above where countless crystalline lights hung like frozen stars. And on this day, every seat was filled with representatives from 1,000 conquered worlds who had come to witness the trial of the last. Kolvathi Valcorix stood in chains at the center of the chamber, his serpentine body coiled upon the cold metal platform designed to hold criminals of his immense size. And though the energy shackles burned against his scales with every breath he took, he refused to lower his head before the assembled masses who stared at him with mixtures of fear and fascination. He was ancient by any standard of measurement, having lived for over 3,000 years and witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties that most species had long forgotten. And his scales, which had once shimmered with the deep purple of royalty, had faded to a duller shade after centuries of service to an empire that no longer wanted him. "Valcorix of the Kolvathi," announced the chief prosecutor, a thin insectoid creature whose voice echoed through amplification systems built into the walls. "You stand accused of sedition against the Zerenthian Empire and direct insult to His Eternal Majesty. High Emperor Tegan Vorath, how do you answer these charges?" The dragon lifted his massive head, and his eyes, which burned with inner fire, swept across the Senate chamber before settling on the ornate throne where the Emperor sat watching with cold amusement. "I answer that I spoke only truth," Valcorix replied, his voice rumbling like distant thunder through the hall. "I declared that Tegan Vorath seized his throne through murder and betrayal, that he poisoned his own father and blamed the assassination on innocent species to justify his wars of expansion. And I stand by every word." Gasps rippled through the assembly, and several senators rose from their seats in outrage, while others shrank back as if expecting immediate violence to erupt. The Emperor raised one slender hand, and silence fell instantly across the chamber with the weight of absolute authority. "The Kolvathi were once great," Tegan Vorath said, his voice soft yet carrying to every corner of the vast space. "Your kind served this empire for 10,000 years as protectors and advisors, but that time has passed, and you are the last of a dying breed clinging to outdated notions of honor." Valcorix felt the old anger rise within his chest, the same fury that had burned in him when he watched his brothers and sisters hunted down one by one over the centuries, eliminated by emperors who feared any power they could not fully control. "We were not protectors," Valcorix growled. "We were prisoners dressed in fine titles, kept alive only as long as we remained useful and obedient. And when we questioned or challenged or dared to speak against injustice, we were labeled threats and destroyed." He turned his gaze back to the assembled senators, many of whom looked away rather than meet his eyes. "I am the last because your empire murdered every other Kolvathi who refused to bow," he continued, "because my kind valued truth over survival. And one by one they paid the price for that principle while I remained silent and compliant like a trained beast." The Emperor laughed, a cold sound that held no warmth or genuine amusement. "And now you finally find your voice when you have nothing left to lose," Tegan Vorath said. How convenient and how pathetic. He stood from his throne and descended the steps slowly, his robes trailing behind him like liquid shadow. "I will not grant you the martyrdom you seek," the emperor declared. "Death would make you a symbol, and I will not allow another Kovathi legend to inspire future rebellion." He stopped at the edge of the platform where Valkyrik stood bound, looking up at the dragon who towered above him even in chains. "Instead, you will be exiled to the quarantine world, designated KX-7749, a planet so hostile that no civilization has ever survived there for more than a single generation. And there you will live out your remaining centuries, alone and forgotten, until time itself erases the memory of the Kovathi." Valkyrik stared down at the emperor, who had destroyed everything he once served. And in that moment, he felt something break inside him that he had not known still existed. It was hope. Then let it be done. Valkyrik said quietly, "Exile me to your death world. Abandon me among the storms and beasts. But know this, Tegan Vorath. Empires built on fear and murder always fall. And I only wish I could live long enough to see yours crumble." The emperor smiled without warmth. "You will live long enough to realize that no one is coming to save you, and no one will remember you existed. That is a far worse fate than any death I could devise." He turned and walked back toward his throne, while guards moved forward to escort the prisoner away. The journey to KX-7749 took 3 standard weeks in the hold of a prison transport ship, and Valkyrik spent every moment of it in darkness and silence, his mind wandering through memories of better times that now seemed like dreams, belonging to someone else. When they finally released him on the surface of the quarantine world, the transport lifted off immediately without ceremony or final words, leaving him standing alone on a rocky plateau beneath a sky choked with storm clouds. The wind hit him first, carrying particles of volcanic ash that stung his eyes and scraped against his scales. And the ground trembled beneath his feet from seismic activity deep below the surface. He spread his wings for the first time in months and felt the weakness in muscles that had atrophied during his imprisonment. And when he tried to lift himself into the air, he managed only a few meters before crashing back down. This world would kill him slowly, he realized. Not through any single catastrophe, but through the gradual wearing down of his body and spirit until nothing remained. He found a cave system in the mountains 3 days later, a network of tunnels carved by ancient lava flows that offered shelter from the acid storms that swept across the surface every few days. There in the darkness he made his home, and there he waited to die. The months passed in a blur of survival and solitude, hunting the massive predators that roamed the volcanic plains, dodging the toxic gas vents that erupted without warning, enduring the crushing loneliness that pressed against his mind like a physical weight. He stopped counting the days after the first year, and he stopped caring about anything beyond the next hunt and the next storm. The Kovathi were gone, and soon he would join them in whatever void awaited his kind after death. He found himself hoping it would come soon, 3 years after his exile began. Valkyrik lay in the deepest chamber of his cave, his body wrapped around itself in the ancient sleeping posture of his species, and he dreamed of flying through clear skies that no longer existed. He did not know that somewhere far above him, a human ship was falling out of the sky, its engines screaming as they failed one by one, carrying a cargo of refugees toward a crash that would change everything. He did not know that the universe was not finished with him yet. He simply slept and waited for an end that refused to arrive.